You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Red Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by...
Ryan Wozniak.
Hey, Ryan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for being here. It's awesome to have you on the show. And finally, after all these years of commenting on the blogs and, and the show, we appreciate you coming on the show.
I love it. You guys help get me addicted and get me out of land use planning a little bit and into my true passion. So
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, yeah, tell us a little bit about like what you do and where you are and all that stuff.
cool. Yeah. On a personal level, the whole son, father, husband roles. My family, my parents actually, I think, brainwashed me into moving to Arizona from Michigan because they kept on talking about how great it was and how they wanted to retire out here one day. And I'd only had childhood memories of it. So I had to go on their instincts. And so eventually I said, okay, of all the places I should live and pursue my career, I guess Arizona seems like a good growing place to do that. And so in 2007, I made my way out here with my fiance at the time, and now my kindergarten teacher wife, who has a knack for tolerating me. So that's good. And I have a father of two with mostly tolerable kids. And I have a small petting zoo at my house, 2 dogs, 1 cat, 1 hamster, 1 lizard, fish tank. And the hedgehog rescue is on the agenda next, I guess, from my wife's perspective. So yeah, we live in Mesa, Arizona, befriended most of the downtown advocates who have a love for downtown, and they have like a trajectory of what they want to see out of the downtown, and I'm all for it, embracing more transit options. The light rails come to downtown in the last 10 years, a lot of local businesses, a lot of like homegrown local businesses, not a whole lot of chains. We have some great beer. I might be a little biased. Also a great cidery. Yeah, got all that going in the personal life. Try to give back to the city in which I live. I've been a transportation advisory board member. I try to get involved in general plan updates and all sorts of good stuff. So stay pretty involved in that. On the professional side, I'm transportation planner now at TY Lynn. Grateful to have landed there because they've been doing some really great work in terms of building out their bike ped and active transportation aspects of their design work. And so I've been just finding myself at home there, helping our clients now navigate different design standards than what they might be used to, from a suburban standard to more of an urban standard. Yeah, I feel like I've landed in the right spot because a colleague of mine presented at an ITE conference recently using the title of the forgiveness paradox, highlighting how too much space given to the automobile to sort of navigate the streets quickly is just a recipe for danger. So yeah, I'm trying to do what we can to help protect the vulnerable people of Arizona.
That's awesome. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit too with that the Canadian article.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to know a little bit more about what's been going on in the Phoenix region. I mean, obviously you're in Mesa, but the region as a whole has been kind of under this discussion spell for expanding transportation, for the sales tax and all that stuff. So what are some of your thoughts on that, or what's been going on in Phoenix in the region writ large?
So we are a state of giant counties, being west of the center of the country, right? Where all of a sudden the counties just go ginormous, and Maricopa County is no different. In the middle of Arizona, we're home to Phoenix and all of the metropolitan area surrounding Phoenix. And our giant county is under the control of the state legislature in order to enable us to tax ourselves for transportation issues. And so our regional metropolitan planning organization, Maricopa Association of Governments, or MAG as I'll refer to them, MAG's been doing a great job for the past few years and doing a lot of public outreach and trying to figure out what they wanted to put together ultimately for an infrastructure improvement plan that would then inform what we could accomplish given a tax rate and the projected tax income that would come from a sales tax. And so as that discussion went on, there was a lot of advocates involved, and I think we we ended up in a pretty good place in terms of compromise. I thought that what we've been doing with tax dollars in the Phoenix metro area in the long term has been, or the past 20 years, has been doing a lot of highway development. We got our ring roads, we got all the greatest hits of suburbia and suburban sprawl, right? So there was a recognition that we were trying to change our patterns a little bit in terms of what we were looking to prioritize. So a little bit more was going to transit, a little bit more was going to active transportation. And so we were nudging those things in the right direction. But when it came to it, when that plan went to the legislature back in 2022, they basically passed the package as is. They went forward with the plan that Meg suggested, and they had provided the enacting legislation to support it. But then we had a Governor Ducey at the time who decided to veto it. And so, for whatever reason, long story short, we've moved forward now into the next fiscal year, or the whole new legislature. And when they took a look at the plans, there were some new leaders in different caucuses, and they said, "Nope, you know what? We're going to take a little bit harsher view on transit investments and active transportation investments and anything that's labeled 'quote unquote' a road diet." And I don't think that Maricopa County is unique in this regard, right? I felt like there was echoes of this across the country.
Yeah, it's in the Texas Republican platform is anti-road diet. So it's not it's actually spreading all over the country now.
Mhm. So yeah, the talking points have gotten out, and so there's a certain angle of politic that is gone anti all these things, and so still just sort of projecting that car-oriented sprawl machine, and more highways always seem better to them, but they really don't see the value in regional investments in transit or active transportation, so they get really critical on those things. When it came to this legislature, I mean, they kept on going round and round and round on it. We finally end up at the enabling legislation that made it to Governor Hobbs' desk now, and she was in support of it. There was some bitter pills in there because they sort of axed anything that was light rail or rail oriented at all. They don't want to see any light rail touch the state capitol grounds, be immediately adjacent to it. And so they put that in there. The couple poison pills, no road diets, or if there is a road diet, it needs to be highly scrutinized and have a full engineering standards. I mean, sort of kind of puts into the legislature what we all know would be process anyways. So in the end, is it all that bad? Probably not. But there was a lot of learning and a lot of hand holding and a lot of conjecture on people's parts in order to get something through. So ultimately, we have enabling legislation that has the right to go to the voters now. And so we're not done yet. We still have to have it on the ballot in 2024 and have it enabled. And if it's not enabled, then we end up in 2025 without a transportation tax, which would be a whole new nightmare for our transit operators.
I can imagine. Yeah, I was just thinking, like, Seattle, they had an election, I think in 2007, with roads and transit on it, and then they balked at that one, and then they brought back the transit only in the next election, where obviously there's Barack Obama's on the ballot, so I think that made a big difference, but they passed that. And so I'm wondering if there was any inkling locally to be like, okay, let's just reject this one and come back later, or is it just like, okay, we finally got something, let's just vote for it and then figure out how to pay for light rail extensions in another way, or whatever else needs to happen.
So we'll definitely have some trading, I think, happening at the local level, because a lot of our transit is funded from local sources. So I think the regional folks at MAG are going to do what they can to support the transit modes that they can best support, and then they're going to leave the rail to the locals. It's going to be interesting because my city of Mesa has one of the nation's largest FTA grants to extend our streetcar system that would connect us to Tempe and ASU. So there's some good points to that, and maybe some more critical. I could ramble on some more critical points of that, but try to not go on that tangent. And so what we end up with is, a lot of responsibility now in the hands of locals to do some extra fundraising outside of the transportation sales tax. And so, I mean, ultimately that is, with that still that big if of the voters ultimately passing it. And so as to the temperature in the room, as to whether or not the voters are ultimately going to pass it, Friends of Transit seem to have good pulling on this, and are hopeful that, it will pass. So all signs are good.
I look forward to looking at the election night vote when it comes up next year.
Yeah. It'll be November 2024.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's get to the news and talk about that stuff, shall we? But
Sure.
first, I got a couple of ads I got to do. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to put all this stuff in the show notes. Get your scarves, get your bookshop books from bookshop.org/shop/the overhead wire. Go to theoverheadwire.com and get your scarves. Go to theoverheadwire.com and get the Raymond Unwin book, or you can find the Cars or Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/Cars or Cholesterol. This is episode 138. We're live and in session. And of course, you can get the show on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, and of course, Apple Podcasts. I'm sorry for the Stitcher folks, but it's
Stitcher guy.
ending. You're a Stitcher guy.
I'm a Stitcher guy. I'm
It's
so
ending
disappointed.
soon. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Were
Yeah.
you able to, what's your new choice for podcast listening?
I feel like I'm just like defaulting to Google as much as it pains me. I don't. I need some
Google
recommendations.
Play.
People
Yeah.
people send me some recommendations on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Find me Ryan Wozniak. Yeah, whatever your podcaster,
Yeah.
podcatcher choice is. Let me know.
Yeah, Tune In is a good one. I've
Okay.
heard of before. There's a couple of others that people have been using, but yeah, sorry about that. Those folks were good. They reached out early on and asked if they could put our show on there, and I do appreciate that. I'm sad to see them go. But let's get to the news. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. You guys know how to get to the newsletter, theoverheadwire.com, as always. So let's start with LA. LA's pre-approved ADU plans. Working with local architects, the city of Los Angeles has developed a pre-approved plan for accessory dwelling units called UADU that would cut down on permitting and approval times. While the city hopes this will mean increased production of less expensive housing and fewer headaches, housing advocates worry that the homes won't be as affordable to renters, and sewer and utility charges are still wildcards. This was by Anjali Rao in Dwell magazine. What do you think about this? About streamlining ADUs for not just Los Angeles, but it seems like this is a good idea everywhere.
Yeah, I think that this has been in the waters across the country for many years, and it's kind of been seen as like maybe the low-hanging fruit, the political win that can win over a lot of municipalities that are dealing with obviously a housing crisis, almost reaching every corner of the United States at this point. So, yeah, I feel like it's an idea that sort of met its time. And then with regards to these automated plans that don't have an administrative review necessarily with regards to what the plan looks like itself. I think that's a great idea. I think that idea, I first heard about it in 2018 when I was attending a CNU conference in Charlotte. There was a gentleman that had come from a political elected background. He was all for it. He was touting its benefits, its successes, and so I took that idea and I brought it back with me to the job I had at the time. And I ended up finding, that there was a lot of concern over that it would create distortions in the free market or the housing market, or what would it do for the prospects of local architects or engineers that would be not in demand or like somehow displaced. So there was a little consternation about that. Unfortunately, I was always a big fan of the idea that you empower people by giving them something that's right off the shelf that might work for them.
Yeah, and this one specifically, it's just a one-bedroom ADU, and it's engineered to be built in really easily. And there are ones that they've also approved that you can get from architects if you want to pay, but they have this free one that you can basically download, I think, from the city, and you have to go through all the other permitting stuff and get electric and all that stuff, but it seems like a really good idea. And one of the things that came up in the article too was like some of the architects that had worked on these types of things previously, they felt like they wouldn't be affordable even after doing all this process. And I think that's a good concern, but at the same time, like I don't know if we can wait that long to wait until things are affordable. I think we just need to keep building and building and building and see like how we can try to finally get some housing units out there, because I think the problem is we're so far behind, and that's kind of why there's such a crisis, that we just need to get on it and start doing it. And I think later on you might be able to see, and ADUs, it's one thing, it's part of the toolbox, as they say in the article, but
Sure.
you need those big buildings with 30 to 50 units and those types of things, obviously. But I think this is part of the mix, and it would be really good if we could just start the ball rolling. And I think California has done a pretty good job of doing that, of building ADUs so far. And so we'll see what happens down the road. I don't know what's the situation in Phoenix with in Mesa with EDUs.
Still not by right. I think there's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of interest in loosening those things. There was a couple points in our state legislature that was trying to preempt things and kind of force the hand of municipalities, but we saw a lot of concern from the local control perspective and our Arizona League of Cities kind of spoke up. I'd like to see some more leadership, and it's something that's actually on my agenda to sort of elevate in the conversation to talk about, what are we trying to do in order to promote the best ideas that came out through those legislation, and what are some of the best practices that cities are really able to accept, like where's their acceptance level, and start chipping away, even if it's a little bit here and a little bit there. I think that, we can eventually get to a place where we do a lot more by right permitting.
Yeah. All right. Learning more about vehicular homelessness. About 20,000 Angelinos live in their vehicles, and about 1 in 20 University of California, Los Angeles students struggle with homelessness as well. M. Nolan Gray writes about his experience living out of his car as a PhD student at UCLA and what might push people into these precarious situations. This was by M. Nolan Gray in The Atlantic. This was an interesting piece by Nolan, and we had him on the show recently to talk about his book Arbitrary Lines, and
Mhm.
I think it's interesting to hear that there are those among us who have basically had to live out of their cars for a small amount of time, whether that's chosen or forced. It's probably not something that people would want to do for too long a period of time, but then there are folks that are forced into it. What have you ever slept in your car or had to sleep in your car?
Not an urban setting. I think I've had some bad weather occur while I was camping type of situation where you're like the car is better option for shelter versus the tent.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, and especially with the heat dome situation that we've had this summer, I just I can't even imagine the amount of trauma that people have to go through. Especially here in Phoenix, anybody who's living out of their car, and our nighttime temperature staying so high these days, like in recent years, we're not getting those lows that allow our bodies to recover properly and from a public health perspective. So it's quite the conundrum. It just goes to show you that we have maybe prioritized more room for cars in our cities than we have housing. Familiar with Nolan's work, I really appreciate his perspective. I think that we need to have more conversations, and he's definitely the guy who's challenging a lot of uncomfortable conversations right now.
Yeah, for sure. Especially around, Houston and covenants and things like that. And this just brings out that as well. And I didn't really think about the weather aspect, but that's true. I mean, if you have all these extreme weather events, that's really it's already hot in people's cars during this day in the sun, and when you get in and have to turn the air conditioning on high. But if you have to have the car running all the time just to keep yourself cool, like what's that cost? What's that cost people already? Housing is expensive enough, but fuel is expensive too, especially if you're, idling forever. And then the environmental cost of that too, versus maybe a cooling center or something along those lines. That's a whole other can of worms there.
Yeah, I know that we're depending a lot on our cooling centers here in Phoenix and the region. And it's definitely a tough conversation. We've got one of the nation's first heat and mitigation officers, David Hondula, over at the city of Phoenix. A lot of respect for him. I knew him while he was at ASU doing some research, and he was definitely pushing a lot of the right conversations, even back then before he was officially appointed. Seeing him work in the back channels and, this reliance on cooling centers while I had my stint in public health, we were getting some feedback from folks that were in these conditions, and they just didn't feel like the cooling center was a very comfortable place to be. Like it just didn't fulfill all of their needs. Like, yeah, it's nice to be able to survive the heat, but what else? Like, what else am I here for? Am I able to connect with my community? Am I here for workforce development? And what can I do to better my situation other than just sit around in air conditioning? And
Hmm.
so I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in those cooling centers, and what ultimately is the most humane approach to housing people, or allowing people the life-saving cooling needs that they have. But what else?
Yeah. Another interesting piece from this article was how people ended up having to live in their cars. Some people chose it. Some people
Mhm.
decided they were going to do that, as an option, and they said to themselves, maybe I'll do this for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, but then I'll get back in a house. Or in Nolan's case, he was like, okay, well, I'll do this for a little while because I have to leave anyways, and my lease is up, so I don't want to pay a whole other year's rent if I can help it. So I'm going to go do this, and then ended up doing it a little bit longer than he expected. And then there's other folks who are forced into it, right? They don't choose it, but they're forced into it because they lose their house or something happens. And we discussed an article maybe a few months ago about homelessness in California, and how one big event that is costs a lot of money, whether it's a medical event or losing your housing, or you get behind on rent 1 month, something along those lines. It's a big event usually that happens that makes people homeless, and it's something that could be stopped with, a little bit of assistance, or maybe a couple $100 here and there from assistance from a city or something like that could actually keep people in their houses. And so I think that was an interesting point too about how people got into the situation that they're in, living in their car.
The costly spiral that then occurs then after, right? And so I think that that's really important. One thing about those that are experiencing homelessness and living out of their car is usually a car is at least a secure enough place to keep what little belongings that you have that you cherish in a secure setting, because those who experience homelessness that I've helped serve here in the city of Phoenix, we have the very popular, the infamous The Zone now in Central Phoenix, which is people that have seemingly found community in their homelessness situations, and they can all relate to one another and they band together. And the important thing is that when one has an appointment to leave their items, they have a community to look after their items that are unsecure. It's those the ability to secure your items and not rely on makeshift house or tent that you don't really have a place to secure items. I think is one of those unknown or underappreciated aspects of those experiencing homelessness.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Shall we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Truth in car advertising needed. Street parking in Japan has been illegal since 1957. A driver in Japan has to have proof of a parking space, leading to more investments in transit and safer streets. But in North America, with much more space, vehicles have grown over time, partly due to how advertising shapes consumer tastes. By 2020, 79% of ads in periodicals in Canada featured an SUV or light truck. Etienne Tremblay suggests that perhaps it's time to make car companies advertise what this really means for our health and safety. This was by Etienne Tremblay in Policy Options Politiques, a Canadian, I think, like a Canadian think tank of sorts. We've posted a lot of articles from them, and they've been really interesting. So I'm glad to have them giving their opinions. I just felt this was really interesting. It was something different, basically saying like we need to have more truth in advertising in auto commercials and advertisements in magazines and things like that. And where is a place that has actually done what we want to do? And it's Japan. It's not the European typical place. It's Japan. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I think that it kind of gets into one of those paradoxical type situations where if you give drivers the space to grow, then they kind of grow. They have that permission, right? And so it's really interesting. And this is like this takes me back to one of your my favorite episodes at the Talking Heavyweights, episode 43, about induced demand and all that kind of stuff. And it has this chicken and egg problem that they note in the article about how urban density is not prioritized. It's thought to exacerbate congestion problems. And I've definitely seen that in my career. And it's been one of those frustrating moments where, yeah, if we give them the space, they will come. Building for what you want and really understanding that you should have goals that help you identify what you want, and you go after it, and you make sure that everything from the design perspective to the experience perspective, that you're not incentivizing the wrong types of things. And just given everything that we know about energy efficiency and the dangers of SUVs and what we're doing from a climate and social and economic perspective and affordability of reaching places and accessibility, I could go on and on, right? Like given all the goals that we know, like we just see the errors of our ways and just taking the easy way out and saying, oh, we have the space. We're North America. We believe in this destiny that the space is out there, so we're there to conquer it and make it our own.
There's some point, it has to be when we run out of space, right? I mean, I guess we're nowhere near there yet necessarily in people's minds, because you keep growing. You fill the space as a gas. You fill the spaces available, right? Is that that's the scientific principle of it all? One thing I found interesting about this piece too is basically that the author thinks that basically you should treat car ads like public health ads or tobacco ads to a certain extent, where you're seeing as a public health measure, where you have to have truth in what you're saying and what you're actually showing. And so his example is like all of these car commercials that show people in these trucks driving through this wilderness and wildlands and stuff, and which some people do, but for the most part, people are just driving them to work in their, in the suburbs or in the city. And so I know I see this all the time. I don't know if you see this. I know that every region has different car commercials to a certain extent because of their advertising alliances that the dealerships have. But But here we have these advertisements of people driving in downtown San Francisco with zero cars around, or on the Bay Bridge with zero cars around. And that never happens, right? Except for on the Sunday morning when they film it and they blocked off traffic for it, or they got a permit or whatever to do it, right? So
Yeah.
have you ever seen that in the car ads, like driving in downtown Phoenix with like zero cars around, or like speeding on a highway that that would never be full of cars?
I've never recognized Phoenix in a car advertisement, but the one example that jumps out to me is the Matthew McConaughey commercial that's almost like ASMR, and he's just like whispering while he's driving quietly through the nighttime city. And it's like, yeah, I guess if you're driving at 3 o'clock in the morning, it could be the open road experience. But we all know what traffic jams look like at the rush hours.
Yeah.
And yeah, the truth of that is rarely highlighted. And wouldn't that give us a different perspective on the space and the capacity of our systems and how they operate and what we're actually contributing to?
Yeah, I was also interested in this piece, the interesting information about Japan too. And I've probably read this somewhere, but basically, you have to have a
Park
parking space
space.
for your car
Yeah, yeah.
to park it. And so, you see, I've watched the shows on Netflix and stuff where you have the kids walking to the grocery store for their parents, whether they're two, the old enough show. Basically, there's cars, but you don't see them as much, and they're not as kind of parked on the street and blocking. And so I feel like it's interesting to see that there's actually a rule about it. It's not just a cultural thing. It's like something they made happen.
I think back to a quote that I know of my friend David Crummy, who talks about how parking spaces are sort of like the Soviet bread. We supply enough parking and people can't get enough of it. And we don't really usually think about the alignment between socialism and parking, but it might make for an interesting political conversation with some folks who take parking for granted and don't necessarily see it as a socialized type of commodity. But yeah, I think it's true. And he's like, there's no free place to store my underwear, so why should there be a free place to store my car? He just tries to highlight the absurdity of it all.
Yeah, right, exactly. And what is there, 7 spaces for every car in the United States or something along those lines? I think they've
I've
done
heard
the
it
math.
quoted 7 and 9, something like
Seven to
that.
nine,
Like,
yeah,
yeah, depending on what region you're from.
it's crazy. It's
Yeah.
crazy. All right, next up, why people won't stop moving to the Sun Belt. Even as record-breaking heat occurs more frequently, the Sun Belt's allure continues as people keep moving to its cities. The 50 counties with the highest heat risk grew 5%, while those with the lowest lost population. A relatively inexpensive supply of housing, lots of jobs, and warm winters pull people in, even with higher risks in the summer. Some suggest that climate change will reverse that trend, but until there are more jobs and cheaper housing in those places, the trend will likely continue. This was by Olga Kazan in The Atlantic. You're in Phoenix, obviously. It's a Sunbelt city. It's where a lot of people are going. Do you think it will ever change, that Phoenix will stop growing and the reverse, people will leave because of climate? Or do you think that it's just going to continue forever and ever and ever?
Guilty as charged. You give people job prospects and you give them an affordable cost of living, and that's the winning combination. In my case, it was also complement that with affordable higher education at Arizona State University. So when I was doing the cost comparison between the universities in Michigan and the universities in Arizona, it was a no-brainer in terms of good rates of college or good standings in terms of the folks that we're reviewing. So the college prospects, the job prospects, the ability to buy a home even on one income and ride the wave of equity as a privileged homeowner that I am. I've been at this for living in this home for 15 years, slowly making it my own and benefiting from a very low cost of a mortgage, sitting on something that was bought at the bottom of the economy or the bottom of the housing market. So yeah, I think we've become quite fortunate. Even going through the refinance when the rates were super low before super inflation hit. I can't necessarily normalize that curve because things are changing in terms of people's calculus. Whether or not the stories about water availability in Arizona, or I think we have the there's the microchip manufacturer that's coming to North Phoenix that's going to attract a lot of jobs, and so I don't think that that's going to let up on the pressure for people to move here either. So as long as the job prospects are looking good and our housing are relatively affordable in terms of coastal cities like in California and East Coast, yeah, it's going to be the attraction factors is always going to be there. And you
How,
know, we measure things in terms of dollars and cents and what we're willing to pay for and what we're willing to sort of not apply a true a price tag to. You know, it's the future cost. It's the unintended costs that we don't account for. And as long as we keep on keeping a blind eye to some of those costs that are stacking up in the background, you know, it's going to continue to look attractive.
yeah, you're playing three card Monty with some of the costs a little bit. I think everywhere in the United States, not just in Phoenix, but
Mhm.
basically stuff is costing more than it appears, and there's a lot of freebies out there. Parking spaces are one of them,
Mhm.
obviously. I'm wondering too, like, I grew up in Houston. I lived in a place that was fairly low cost, and a lot of people, housing expansion and livability in terms of like cost of living prices and those types of things. But I'm curious how much of it is like weather related. I've always heard this myth of the snowbird
Right.
leaving the northern states, and it sounds like that's some of your experience too. But leaving the northern states and being like, I'm tired of being cold in the winter, and who cares if it's hot in the summer? I'm going to play golf in in the wintertime.
Yeah, people definitely come here. You know, it might be a bit of an afterthought, but they'll say that they'd rather shovel sunshine than shovel snow. You know, in my perspective too, I try to stay active through the hottest parts of the year, and you can do that in the evenings, you know, and sort of beat the heat. Like I'll play volleyball tonight, and after the sun's gone down, and you can't do that necessarily in cold climates. You just can't wait for the sun to go down and the weather gets better in the winter season. So I think from a weather perspective and trying to be active and healthy and experience your community, there's something to be said for warmer climates because you can beat the heat by waiting for the later temperatures, even though the evening temperatures aren't dropping down as low as we'd like them to, or like they naturally would in a more natural setting because of our urban heat island and
Hmm.
our machineries that are letting off heat from that are still kicking on, or heat pumps that are generating cool air in our indoor spaces, but letting off heat out in the outdoor spaces. So there's all these factors, and is that I think that water and power are the lifeblood of the Phoenix metro area. If our water becomes so low that we can't generate hydroelectricity and we can't then generate enough electricity to keep our indoor housing cool, it's going to be the related to punch combo that takes out our existence, and we're really not the most resilient community in terms of the nation. So how can we incentivize living in more resilient places? That's I think that's yet to be found. I don't think I know the silver bullet or the silver shotgun spray that
Yeah, yeah.
of all of the elements that need to come together in order to make that happen. It's beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, I mean, we always talk in California. We want to let more people in. But then there's other people who don't want to let anybody in. So
Yeah.
you have this fight between how much you should build, how much you should allow folks to move here, how much the weather matters to folks, how much it matters to how much electricity you have to generate, etc. The last couple of days have been warm here, which is, if you'll be laughing at us in Phoenix, obviously, but in San Francisco, it's been in the 70s, and for us, the natives, that's warm because I'm used to having a 54-degree day most of the time with the fog coming in. So it's a little bit interesting to see what happens when it gets a little warm here, and how that impacts how people stay outside or recreate, or also because we don't have air conditioners as well. I don't have one here,
Mhm.
so it's a totally different world to me. Even though I did grow up in Texas and I did run at midnight to beat the heat,
Mhm.
but it's totally different now. My skin is adjusted to the cold weather here, I guess.
Yeah, we have to adjust too, just in the opposite
Yeah,
direction.
exactly. Philly's potential future Highline. Philadelphia has been trying to acquire the Reading Viaduct for 2 decades, but the owner has purchased the asset from what remained of the Reading Railroad has been tough to work with or even contact. The city wants to create its own version of New York's famous Highline, but the former rail viaduct has sat empty and unused. Now the city is given the green light to get the properties by any means necessary, including condemnation. This is by the wonderful Inga Saffron at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Interesting. I feel like there's been a lot of replication of the High Line, and a lot of people want to. Miami has the Underline, and other places have these park blocks and things like that they want to copy, using old infrastructure as ways to recreate. And this is just the latest in that series, I think. But it's interesting to see that an old rail line is something that this company that has nothing to do with rail lines or recreation wants to keep for some reason,
Yeah.
and it's been hard for the city to get it back. What do you think about this?
This one is puzzling, right? I think it kind of challenges our real estate investment 101 lessons that we're learned that people who have assets are trying to maximize the utilization of those assets. And why would they just sit on things that have value and not maximize those value? And it just kind of shows that like maybe the 101 theory doesn't always apply because there are people that just have, I don't know, apparently too much money on their hands to maximize their assets. And so I think it just kind of calls into question, like, how much assets can be in any person's control and really benefit the communities that they're part of. And at what point does the community have the right to condemn properties like this? And yeah, I wonder if all of our precedents around these legal issues are really in best places that should be, given these types of examples.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what condemnation means, or even like takings law means, right? This thing we learned from planning school,
Mhm.
because ultimately it's who knows what useful is, or what blighted
Right.
is, or any of
Hmm.
those terms that we use to think about how we would do redevelopment. The person or the company, basically, they do movie theaters, but they own this, property along with some parcels around it that have been, left to dumping and those types of things. But it's interesting to see how they're just not using it, and so the city kind of is in its best interest to do a taking, or to make it, something, to realize something that's valuable. And that land must be valuable, but like you said, it's kind of baffling that the highest and best use theory of urban development isn't in the cards for them. So, there's 10 vacant lots they own along the right of way. They own the viaduct, but they just don't seem to want to do anything with it, even though the city has this grand plan to make it into something that would probably turn their land valuable even more. But maybe that's just something they're waiting for a long lost Sunday to deal with.
Yeah, the author talks about like how mind-boggling it is that the planners aren't more involved and how like private interests can be planning without the city planners' involvement. And in some of my experience, sometimes the city planners get in the way. Like so, like have at it, like private side or community groups or those that are not officially involved in the city's operations or quote unquote city officials. Like sometimes you have to make things happen on your own and start lining up the stars. So yeah, I think that this is one of those things that just because you have the title of planner doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be the one in the middle of everything. Sometimes you can kind of gum up the system. So I have enough humility, I guess, to sort of step aside when I'm a planner that doesn't know how to make things better. Like if somebody else has the plans to make things better, then by all means, like just yeah, how can we complement the good work that you're trying to do?
Yeah, for sure.
So,
I mean, and that's what's interesting about the last two Talking Headways shows with Ryan and David.
David.
Yes, David Longoria and Ryan Winkle, talking
Hmm.
about, sometimes it's good to just get out of the way, like give people a few tools, and let them do
Hmm.
their thing, and let them figure out what they want, and help them in any way you can. But,
Right.
or so what was the thing that they talked about? It was really interesting, talking about like code compliance, where you're basically
Hmm.
going to get somebody evicted if you make them fix their sign. And so you got to watch out for those little things too. So, sometimes with planners, it can get a little bit dicey in terms of, you want to follow the rules, but you also don't want to follow to the rules to the extent that you're basically ruining somebody's life.
Right.
So there's those types of things too.
Yeah, and I guess this is an opportunity to give a plug to Impact too. That's coming to Phoenix in November
Yeah.
5th through the 8th. And this is a great venue for having those kind of conversations between those city officials and the community who wants to get things done. And sometimes the city officials are in the community's way. And I think if we can open up channels of honest dialogue like that, then everybody's going to benefit. And so I really cherish those moments where we can have those open and honest dialogues. And Ryan and David are two guys that are not afraid to push that envelope. So I love those guys.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each week. This show and Talking Hayways really wouldn't be here without you, so thank you very much. $10 a month gets you a transportation scarf, and $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note, along with that cars are cholesterol sticker. So we're looking forward to that. Listener questions and comments. This is where the part of the show where some folks can comment on what's we've been talking about or anything else. If you wish to do that, feel free to email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I'm looking forward to reading people's emails. And then some folks will write me emails and say, I don't want this to be published, but I just wanted to say hi or let you know what I think on this issue. And I appreciate those too. So feel free to send those in. Gotten a number of those this week. Puppies and Butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. So Ryan, do you have any puppies and butterflies for this week?
Well, your scarf mention reminds me that your scarves make great gifts because I've had people that I've cajoled into doing community activism and having those sort of sidebar conversations or events that don't necessarily fit within the city's theme of community engagement. So I've taken it on my own to organize some community engagement options here in Mesa. And so Nadi Gulati, who was working at Project for Public Spaces at the time, she was out here for a conference, and I cajoled her into doing a little Project for Public Spaces think tank around like making our transit stations more portals to places was the tag. And so in order to thank her for her volunteered efforts, I made sure to buy her a scarf, and then she knew, I knew that she was the right type of recipient for such a
Nice.
gift, and she knew I was the right type of giver for such a gift. And she's like, "Oh, you're such a nerd!" Like, as are you. Like, let's just embrace it.
That's the best. That's the best. Yeah, folks use the scarves for giving away at raffles, for gifts at Christmas time, and those types of things. And I really love to hear all those stories because I love that that they're so loved that they can be given as gifts, or people can feel appreciated by just having the bus only scarf around their neck. That's awesome. For me, I don't know if I have any stories necessary. Hurricane is pretty ridiculous right now. Obviously, you're getting some rain from the hurricane, but the fact that there was a 5.1 or a 5.3 earthquake in Southern California at the same time as this hurricane was going through is pretty crazy, and I guess a sign of our times. So that was something that popped up that my brother-in-law, who lives in Bakersfield with my sister, sent yesterday to the text chat that we have, saying, "Oh, hurricane. Okay, this is a thing now," which is pretty good. And then also this week,
Not associated, right?
nope.
Just completely different
Just totally.
natural events that coincided. But people always like to make
Yeah,
correlations,
well,
right? Like, oh, because
yeah, Sharknado, things like that. But yeah, like that's the thing too. Is basically one thing my mom always says is you pick your natural disaster wherever you live in the country. You pick whichever one. You get hurricanes in Texas, you get earthquakes in California, you get all this stuff. But now we have hurricanes, so I guess we added one to our lexicon here. And then also this week, I think Ahsoka is coming. Star Wars. I'm a big Star Wars fan, so the show is coming on Disney Plus. I'm looking forward to that and continuing the stories of the cartoon Rebels. And that was a really great show and a continuation, obviously, of the Clone Wars cartoon, which was basically George and Ryan's a Trekkie, so that's that's fine.
I'm sorry,
No worries.
to break up the party on the Star Wars. I was always more of a Star Trek guy.
That's fine. Totally fine. I am not one of those people that dislikes. I watched the movies and I enjoyed them. But yeah, so anyways, that's coming up. So I'm looking forward for that too. Well, Ryan, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
Yeah, I stay pretty active on LinkedIn. Try to share out any content or best resources that are available that I think other people could be aware of. Active at building the newsletter for the Arizona chapter of APA all the time, so I'm always digging around looking for good content to share. So sometimes it leaks into my LinkedIn, so feel free to see me there. You'll get more of the activist vibe from the platform formerly known as Twitter. So that's at Ryan Woz AICP, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm going to call it Twitter until it's dead. You can find me on Twitter at the Overhead Wire. And it just got even worse though when he killed TweetDeck. He might kill blocking. I'm not giving him any money for that. That's just not going to happen for me.
Nah.
But you can also find me at theoverheadwire.com. You can also find me on Mastodon, where I'm posting the best of links every day to at the Overhead Wire at sfba.social. And thanks for joining us at Mondays at the Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring the Suits podcast. Thank you, Ryan, for coming on the show. We appreciate it. I hope you have
awesome,
a wonderful and enjoyable volleyball game in the night. And thanks again for coming.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit humid out there, given the little rain burst that I heard, but it's going to be fine.
That's awesome.
Thanks, Jeff. It's always wonderful, and just hello to all my transit nerds out there who are listening to the Overhead Wire.
That's awesome. Awesome. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Talk